AITA for cutting ties after my mom said my son isn't a real grandchild? My name is Rachel. I am 41 years old. I work as a financial analyst at a mid-sized company in the Denver metropolitan area in Colorado, and I am a single mother to a boy named Jacob who is 7 years old. He has dark eyes and a habit of keeping things he finds pretty inside a shoebox under the bed. Rocks, bottle caps, a gold button he found on the sidewalk on a Tuesday afternoon. He does not throw away anything that has value to him. Sometimes I think he learned that from me, except I learned it the wrong way, keeping things that should have been discarded long ago. Before that Christmas dinner, I was the type of person who swallowed humiliations with a smile. Not because I was a coward, but because I thought tolerance was a virtue, that keeping family peace was an act of love, and that if I waited long enough, the people around me would evolve. It took me too long to understand that some people do not evolve. They just settle better into the space you make for them. Jacob came to me when he was 3.5 years old through the foster care system. I was 34. I had just gotten divorced, and most of the people around me thought I had gone crazy. My mother, Patricia, was the clearest about that opinion. She did not say it in those words, but she said it in every other possible way. She said it with her silence when I told her. She said it with her questions about what I was going to do with my life afterward. She said it with the way she looked at Jacob the first time I brought him home, as if he were a problem I had brought upon myself. My mother is 63 years old. She retired early from an administrative position at City Hall, and since then she has dedicated herself to remodeling spaces that do not need remodeling, attending senior citizen groups where she tells improved versions of her own story, and managing what she calls a family, but which in practice is a silent hierarchy where she decides who belongs and who is just passing through. My father, Richard, is 67. He was the manager of an agricultural cooperative for decades, a position he is proud of in a way that I never saw translate into real money. The cooperative closed when he was 58. Since then, he has a home office where he spends hours making spreadsheets for projects that never leave the paper, and a partner named Gary with whom he has a small consulting business that basically generates just enough to justify the title of entrepreneur, without generating enough to pay the bills. 5 years ago, my father asked me for a loan. He called me on a Sunday morning with the voice of someone who had been rehearsing the speech for days. He said it was temporary, that the business with Gary was about to take off, and that he needed an investment so as not to lose an important contract. I had savings. I had told myself for years that those savings were for Jacob's future, but it was my father. And I was raised to believe that family takes care of family. I transferred $1,500 that afternoon. The following month, my father needed another $1,000. The next quarter, $1,250 more. In 5 years, I had transferred almost $35,000 to my father's account, and the business with Gary was still about to take off. I never received a dime back. I never received an account statement. I received vague thanks, vague promises, and the growing feeling that I was financing a fiction. And while I financed my father's fiction, my mother remodeled the bathroom, bought new furniture for the living room, and treated Jacob as if he were a tolerated guest who had arrived without warning and overstayed his welcome. I noticed. I am a financial analyst. I notice everything, but I also specialized in not saying anything because saying something meant starting an argument and I was not sure how it would end. So I kept things like Jacob keeps rocks in his shoebox, except I kept grudges, and grudges are much heavier than rocks. Until that Christmas. That dinner was supposed to be simple. My family at my mother's house, the table set with the good china she only uses on Christmas. The presents under the artificial tree she bought on sale during Black Friday 3 years ago. My brother Michael was there with his wife Jennifer and their 2 children Brandon and Ashley, who are 8 and 10 years old. I was there with Jacob. Jacob stayed quiet during part of the dinner, which is normal for him. He observes before participating. He has a way of evaluating the environment before entering it, as if he needed to be sure he is welcome before taking up space. Sometimes that breaks my heart because I know where that habit comes from. Children who have already been rejected learn to become invisible as a precaution. After dinner, my mother brought out a tray of decorated cookies, the usual ones, butter cookies with colored icing, which she makes every time Ashley and Brandon are present because they are their favorite dessert. Ashley took 3. Brandon took 2. Jacob waited, looked at me as he always does when he is not sure if he can, and I gave him an encouraging nod. He reached his hand toward the tray, and my mother pulled the tray away before he got there. It was not a subtle gesture. It was deliberate, visible, and unmistakable. She said in the voice she uses when she is being sincere without meaning to be cruel that she had made those cookies for her grandchildren. The table fell silent for a second, and then Jennifer, my sister-in-law, laughed. A small, nervous laugh, the kind people let out when they do not know what to do with discomfort. My brother Michael looked at his plate. My father looked toward the window, and I looked at my son's face. He slowly lowered his hand without crying or throwing a tantrum and sat with his hands in his lap, looking at the tablecloth as if he were studying the embroidery. It was not my mother's gesture that broke something in me at that moment. It was the silence of the men who could have spoken up and the laugh of the woman who chose to laugh. I got up from that table without making any speeches. I took Jacob's jacket from the coat rack in the entryway, put it on him, grabbed my purse, said good night in the most neutral voice I could muster, and walked out. Jacob stayed quiet in the passenger seat while I started the car. The street was lit by the Christmas decorations my mother puts in the windows every year. Those cold lights that make everything look like a stage setting. I slowly drove out of the gated community and drove in silence for 2 blocks before he said anything. He asked me if he had done something wrong. I told him no, that he had not done anything wrong. He sat thinking for a moment with that way of his of processing things before speaking. Then he said he thought Grandma Patricia did not like him very much. It was not an accusation. It was not crying. It was an observation carefully formulated by a 7-year-old boy who had already lived long enough to know that some doors stay closed to some people, and that it makes sense to map out which doors those are before trying to open them. I told him I loved him, that was never going to change, and that there was nothing wrong with him. He nodded, looked out the window, and did not ask anything else. I got home, put Jacob to bed, and went to the kitchen with my laptop open on the counter. I could not sit down. I stood in front of the computer, like I always do when I am processing something, and started moving Excel spreadsheets around. Of course, just to have the numbers in front of my eyes, because numbers are the only things that do not lie to me. I opened the transfer history. Almost $35,000 in 5 years, transferred in irregular deposits. Whenever my father called or sent a message, it was always with some specific justification and the implicit promise that it was the last time. It was never the last time. I stared at that number for about 20 minutes. Then I closed the laptop, opened it again, and stared some more. There is something strange that happens when you finally look at a number you avoided for a long time. It is not surprise. Surprise assumes you did not know. You knew. You simply had not allowed the number to become real, concrete, and nameable. When it finally does, it is like looking at the size of a hole you dug in the ground yourself and walked around for years without admitting it was there. I sent a message to my friend Laura at 11 o'clock that night, which is the kind of thing you only do with someone who is truly a friend. I wrote, I need to tell you what happened today. Laura has been my friend for 12 years. We met in a finance course in Denver, and became inseparable at the speed with which 2 people become inseparable when they discover they have the same way of seeing the world. She is a speech therapist, which means she has spent her entire professional life listening to what people have a hard time saying, and she developed a rare talent for hearing what is not being said. She called instead of replying to the message. I answered. I told her what happened with the cookie tray. I told her about Michael's silence, Jennifer's laugh, and Jacob's question in the car. Laura stayed quiet for a second, then said, Talk to me about the money. It was not what I expected her to say, but that is how Laura is. She gets straight to what matters without beating around the bush. I talked to her about the money. I talked to her about the almost $35,000, about the years of transfers, about my father's promises, and about how I had never added up the total out loud to anyone other than myself. She stayed quiet again. When Laura stays quiet, it is because she is really thinking, not because she has nothing to say. Then she asked me if I had access to my father's business accounts. I did. I had access because my father one day asked me to keep an eye on the accounts. I logged into the system to help and never logged out. He simply never asked me to log out, and I never asked myself why. Laura said, Open the accounts right now and tell me what you see. I opened them. What I saw that night was the beginning of a story that would take me weeks to process completely, But the first paragraph was all there, legible, dated, detailed, waiting for someone with access and a willingness to look to finally reach it. My father did not have a business that was about to take off. My father had a business that had never really left the paper, with a partner who came and went as it suited him, and a financial structure that only stayed afloat because of the transfers I made and what the business paid out. When it paid out, it went into a joint checking account with my mother, from which came the remodeled bathroom, the new furniture, the trip they took to Orlando in March, and a series of purchases that had nothing to do with agricultural consulting. I stared at those spreadsheets until almost 2 in the morning. Then I closed everything, drank a glass of water, and went to check on my sleeping son in his room. Jacob was sleeping with his mouth slightly open and his arms thrown to the sides with that total surrender children have when they feel safe. The shoebox was under the bed, visible from the edge of the mattress, full of the things he had decided were worth keeping. I stood in the doorway of his room for an amount of time I could not tell you, and I thought, this child is going to have a future, and I am not going to build his future by paying for the lives of people who cannot acknowledge he exists. I spent the days following Christmas doing what I do when I need to understand something. I organized. I am a financial analyst by training and by temperament. I have a method for transforming chaos into clean pages, and that method was what I used in the week between Christmas and New Year's. While my son played in the living room and my family pretended that dinner had not happened, I printed the account statements. All 5 years of transfers organized by date and amount. I created a binder with colored dividers. Blue for what I had sent, red for the identified expenses in the business account that were not business related, and yellow for my father's messages asking for money. There were 31 request messages, some by phone call, noted down by me at the time with date and amount in my planner, most by text saved on my phone with that way people have of asking without making it seem like they are asking. Expressions like, "It would be easier for us if you could help," or, "It is temporary. I will pay you back as soon as we close the contract." A contract was never closed. It was never paid back. I requested an appointment with a trusted accountant, Mr. Carlson, who works with the company where I am an analyst and has helped me with personal matters before. I brought the binder. Mr. Carlson is a man who has a habit of taking off his glasses before saying something that is going to hurt. He took off his glasses halfway through the 3rd page. After reading everything, he put his glasses back on, looked at me and said, "Rachel, you did not lend money to your father. You financed a life that was unsustainable without your subsidy. And the difference is important because a loan has a conscious debtor. What you have here is a structure where awareness was convenient when they needed you and inconvenient when they did not." I asked him what I could do. He said that the messages asking for money, combined with the transfer receipts, constituted evidence of a debt. It was not a formal contract, but it was enough documentation to support a claim if I wanted to pursue it. I still did not know if I wanted to. What I knew was that I needed to understand the real size of what I was holding up before deciding whether I would continue holding it up. The numbers were these. Almost $35,000 in 5 years. An average of $7,000 a year, more than what I earned in 2 months of work every year, going to a structure that primarily benefited my mother, who never appeared in the requests but always appeared in the expenses. The bathroom remodel cost $5,000. New appliances, $2,500. The trip to Orlando, $2,000. A new flat-screen television, furniture for the home office that belonged to my father, but where my mother hosted her friends for her book club. Purchases at clothing stores that were listed as office supplies. I closed my laptop that night with a clarity that is not exactly anger and is not exactly sadness. It is something colder than both. It is the moment when you stop wondering if you are misunderstanding and begin to accept what you always knew, that you were being used, that the use was structural, and that it only continued because you allowed it. My mother called on December 28th. She did not mention the dinner. She did not mention Jacob. She asked how I was and how Jacob was, with that tone of forced normalcy that people use when they want you to understand that the matter is closed without anyone having to say it is closed. I let her speak. At the end of the call, almost in passing, she said that my father had a new opportunity in the business, that Gary had gotten a promising contact, and that they were going to need some support in the coming months so as not to lose momentum. I said I would think about it. I hung up the phone and did not think about anything else related to money that day. I thought about other things, about the way Jacob had sat with his hands in his lap at the Christmas table, about the voice with which he asked if he had done something wrong, about the fact that my 7-year-old son already had enough emotional vocabulary to ask if a grandmother loved him and enough maturity to accept the answer with more dignity than most of the adults at that table. Laura came over for coffee on the morning of the 29th. We sat on my backyard deck, which has a planter with ferns that Jacob helped me plant, and a rocking chair I bought for myself on an impulse after I got approved for a promotion, which is probably the best emotional financial decision I have ever made. I told Laura what Mr. Carlson had said. I showed her the binder. She went page by page slowly with her coffee getting cold next to her. When she reached the last page, she stared at the total for a while. Then she said, "And what did your mom say about what happened with Jacob?" "Nothing," I replied. "She did not say anything." Laura looked at me. "And what did your dad say?" "Nothing either." Silence. "And what did your brother say?" My brother Michael had sent me a message on the 27th saying, "Happy New Year," with a champagne emoji. Nothing else. Laura placed the binder on the table with a care that told me everything she was choosing not to say. Then she picked up her coffee, took a sip and said, "Their silence is also information, Rachel. And you, being an analyst, know how to read the information." I knew. I knew that Michael's silence meant he had chosen not to have seen, that my father's silence meant he had chosen not to take a stand, and that my mother's silence meant that for her, nothing had happened that deserved an explanation. 6 adults at a table, a child with his hand pulled away from a cookie, and the only thing anyone had spoken about since then was the new opportunity in Gary's business. I went to the kitchen for more coffee and stood in front of the window for a moment, looking out at the yard. Jacob was out there, crouched near the wall, examining something on the ground with that total concentration he has when he finds something interesting. Probably a rock, probably going into the box. I thought he deserves more than what I have given him, not in money but in decisions. January arrived with that feeling of a false start that the new year brings. My father called on January 4th. It was not a surprise. I was expecting the call. Every time a new cycle of financial support was about to begin, he called around that date with that voice of someone explaining the obvious. This time I listened to everything without interrupting. Gary had made a contact with a cooperative in another state. It was promising. They needed an amount to close the initial paperwork. Notary, registration, presentation materials. $2,500 that my father promised to return as soon as the contract was signed. I let him finish. Then I asked, "Dad, where did the money I sent last quarter go?" Silence. I asked again with the same neutral voice I use when reviewing a balance sheet with a client. "The $1,750 from October, what were they applied to in the business?" He said there had been operating costs, that Gary needed something to maintain the office, that the details were complicated. I said I would think about the request and call him back later. I did not call him back. Instead, I spent the following days doing something I should have done 2 years prior. I logged into my father's business system with the passwords he had given me himself, and I did a full audit. It was a disaster, not in the sense of elaborate fraud, but in the sense of the mess made by people who do not know how to manage money and were never forced to learn. Sporadic income from small contracts, outflows that did not correspond to anything identifiable as real operating costs, and accumulated debt with suppliers that my father had taken on with the expectation that the contract with Gary would eventually arrive and cover everything. The contract with Gary never arrived. What arrived with regularity was the money I sent. I made a separate spreadsheet of the total I had sent over 5 years. I could track where a large part of it went. The real costs of the business represented about 30%. The rest had gone from the business account to my parents' joint account in transfers that my father had vaguely registered as partner withdrawals. My mother was not a business partner. She did not appear on the documents at all, but the money went to an account with her name on it. I showed the spreadsheet to Mr. Carlson in a second meeting. He looked at it for 5 minutes without saying anything. Then he said, "Do you have all this documented?" "I have everything," I replied. He said that this, combined with the request messages and the transfer receipts, was more than enough to support whatever path I decided to take, through the courts or through private negotiation. I asked him what he recommended as a first step. He said, "The first step is for you to decide what result you want, because what you do depends on where you want to get to." I went home and thought about that for 3 days. What result did I want? Did I want the money back? Yes. Almost $35,000 represented Jacob's emergency fund, his college tuition, the trips we never took, and the car that still had a dent in the bumper because I had postponed the repair for 2 years since there was always something more urgent. And more than anything, I wanted not to have to explain to my son when he grew up why I had chosen silence. Laura sent me a message halfway through that week. She just said, "How are you?" I replied, "I am putting together a binder." She replied with a heart emoji. It was all she needed to say. Michael called on Thursday. It was the first time he had called since Christmas. He asked if I was okay, if Jacob was okay, with that vaguely guilty tone people have when they know they should have done something and did not. I asked him if he knew about the money. There was a long pause. He said he knew I helped, that he thought it was something small, that my mother had said I contributed from time to time because I wanted to. My mother had said I did it because I wanted to. I told Michael I would send him a spreadsheet for him to read before we spoke again. I sent it to him. He did not call me back for a week. When he called, his voice was different, more subdued. He said, "Rachel, I did not know it was that much." "I know you did not know," I replied, "but now you know." I picked a Sunday to go to my parents' house. Michael confirmed he would come with Jennifer and the kids. I did not tell any of them what I was planning. Jacob stayed with Laura. She had bought new Play-Doh and promised they would make dinosaurs. Jacob loved the idea. He let go of my hand, smiling. I went to the car, put the binder on the passenger seat, and sat in the parking lot for about 3 minutes before starting the engine. I was not afraid. I was calibrating. There is a difference between speaking with anger and speaking with clarity, and I needed clarity. Anger makes the other person defend themselves. Clarity makes the other person see themselves. I arrived at my parents' house. The door was open as always on Sundays. I went in, said hello, and sat down at the table where the food was already being served. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, and the salad my mother makes because my father likes it. We ate. My mother asked about Jacob. I said he was fine, that he had stayed with Laura. She made a comment about Laura that was at once polite and dismissive, in her signature style. I let it go. Michael looked at me once during the meal. I blinked. He lowered his gaze to his plate. After the meal, as the plates were being cleared and my mother was about to get up for dessert, I placed the binder on the table. It was a white binder with colored dividers. Blue for my transfers, red for the identified expenses, and yellow for the messages. My father recognized the binder before I said a word. I saw the recognition in his expression, that specific tightening around the eyes when something that was being avoided finally arrives. I said, "I want to talk about the last 5 years." My mother came back from the kitchen with a pie, put it on the table, sat down, and looked at the binder like someone looking at an uninvited guest. I opened the first divider. I spoke in the voice I use in earnings presentations, without emotional excess, listing dates and amounts. Totals, 31 requests, almost $35,000 in transfers, printed receipts, numbered and organized. My father stared at the tablecloth. Jennifer took Michael's hand under the table. I saw the movement. I opened the second divider. I listed the expenses I had identified in the business accounts that were not business related. The bathroom remodel, the appliances, the trip to Orlando, the clothing purchases logged as supplies. I stated the amounts without commentary, just the amounts. My mother started to say something about the context, about the costs of maintaining a house, about how much she and my father had done for me throughout my life. I let her finish. Then I said, "I know all that, and yet I chose to help. The issue is not whether you did things for me. The issue is that what was requested was never called by its name, that the money never returned, and that while I financed this account, my son was treated at this family's table as if he were less than the other grandchildren." The living room fell silent. Michael said, in that voice I had already heard over the phone, "I did not know it was that amount. My mom said you helped out occasionally, that it was not a big deal." I looked at my mother. She did not say anything. I said, "Not a big deal." Almost $35,000 in 5 years is not a big deal. My father opened his mouth, closed it, and looked toward the window. It was the same posture from Christmas dinner, the same refusal to meet anyone's eyes. Michael wanted to know what I planned to do. I said there was enough documentation for a civil claim if necessary, that my accountant had reviewed it, that the decision on how to proceed depended on what happened from then on, but that, regardless of the financial aspect, there was something that needed to be said and heard at that table. At Christmas dinner, my mother took a tray of cookies out of my son's hands in front of everyone, and called it a natural division among grandchildren. And there was not a single person at that table who said anything. My mother started saying it had been a misunderstanding, that Jacob was too sensitive, that she had never intended. I stopped her. I said, "It is not about the intention. It is about what happened and what nobody did. Jacob is 7 years old. He asked me in the car if he had done something wrong. That is what he took away from that night." Jennifer let out a breath through her mouth that was not a sigh but was clearly something she had been holding back. And then to my surprise she was the one who spoke. She said, "Michael, I tried to tell you that something was wrong with the way they treated Jacob. You said I was exaggerating." Michael turned red. The conversation that followed was not dramatic in the sense of shouting. It was dramatic because things were said that had never been said before. I did not make the January transfer. I did not announce that I was not going to make it. I simply did not make it. In the second week of January, my father sent a message asking if there had been any problem with the bank. I replied that there was no problem with the bank. He did not respond immediately. When he did, the next day the message had a different tone. He asked if we could talk. I said yes to call me whenever he wanted. He called 2 days later. He said the business was in trouble, that without the early year investment some accounts would not balance out, that he understood there were things to resolve, but that this was not the time. I asked, "Dad, when do you think the time will be?" Silence. I said, "In 5 years I made 31 investments. I never received an account statement. I never received $1 back. When you tell me that this is not the time, I need to understand what time you are waiting for because I no longer know how to calculate when it is going to arrive." My father stayed quiet for a long time. Then he said he understood and that he was going to think of a way to fix it. I did not reply anymore. Their financial situation started showing cracks. My mother stopped mentioning the garden renovations. The book club started meeting outside her house. My father stopped talking about his plans with confidence. Michael called in mid-January. He asked for my forgiveness, not just about Jacob but for having spent years believing our mother's version without asking questions. I said, "Thank you for calling, Michael." It was not forgiveness yet. It was acknowledgement, but it was a start. Jennifer sent me a separate message saying she regretted not having said anything at the time of the dinner. I replied that I understood the shock, and that what mattered was what was done afterward. My mother did not call for 3 weeks. When she did, the call was short. She asked about Jacob with a slightly different attention, more careful. She did not say anything about the binder. She did not say anything about the money. At the end of the call, she said Jacob was a very handsome boy. I said he was. Mr. Carlson and I discussed the possible paths. I chose the out-of-court option, a formal demand letter acknowledging the total of the transfers as a documented debt and proposing a payment plan. Did not have to be fast. It had to be real. My father received the letter at the end of January. He called me hours later. He said he had never thought of it as a debt. I asked, "How did you think of it?" He said, "As family help." I said, "Family help has a thank you at the end, and it never creates a scene like the one at Christmas dinner." He stayed quiet. His lawyer contacted Mr. Carlson in February. There was no possible defense. There was a payment plan to negotiate. I agreed to negotiate not because I had forgiven, but because I decided my son would grow up knowing his mother did not give up what was hers out of fear of displeasing someone. February arrived with that dry Colorado winter. I started the month differently. I had a signed payment plan for 48 months. It was real. I had a car without dents because I finally took it to the shop. I had an honest relationship with Michael and Jennifer, and I had Jacob. Jacob was fine. He had started coming home from school telling stories with a confidence I had not seen in him. One Saturday in February he asked me to make cookies. I asked him what kind. He said he wanted the ones with colored icing, the ones shaped like little figures. Completely out of season. I bought everything on Friday. On Saturday we opened the cookie cutters and put everything on the table. Laura arrived at 10 with her thermos of coffee. She saw the flower disaster and sat down at the counter without anyone inviting her. Jacob picked out the cutters. Star, tree, moon, one that looked like a rabbit but he decided was a dinosaur. We mixed. We rolled out the dough. Jacob used the rolling pin with all his strength and seriousness. While the cookies were in the oven, Laura asked Jacob what he wanted to be when he grew up. He thought for a second and said he wanted to be a scientist or a baker because both things involved mixtures and experiments. Laura said it was the smartest answer she had heard in months. He looked very satisfied. When the cookies came out, Jacob iced them with the concentration of an artist. When he finished, he lined them all up, looked at the result and said, "They turned out pretty, didn't they?" He picked up the first one, took a bite, and looked at me with that sparkle children have when something simple is exactly what it is supposed to be. There was no one to pull the tray away. There was no one to tell him he was not real enough to reach what was within everyone's grasp. There was a morning of oven heat, flour on the counter, Laura critiquing Jacob's icing technique, and my son eating what he had made with his own hands without asking permission to exist. I sometimes think about what I lost in those 5 years, not just the money. I think about the decisions I did not make in order to finance those of others, but I also think about what I learned. I learned that numbers do not lie, that silence is not peace, it is just postponed peace with interest. I learned that family can be love or pressure, and the difference is noticeable when you say no. Jacob's shoebox has a new rock as of last week. He brought it from school and showed it to me earnestly. A white rock with a perfect gray stripe down the middle. He said it looked like a road. I told him he was right. He put it in the box, closed the lid, and pushed it back under his bed. Then he went to the living room to do his homework. I went to the kitchen, made myself some tea, and stood looking out the window at my ferns, which were growing more than I expected. The life I have is smaller in the number of people than I thought it was supposed to be. It is quieter. It is more honest, and my son wakes up every morning, comes to the kitchen, and hugs me before asking what is for breakfast. It is not dramatically different. It is simply true. And the truth I finally learned is enough. Comment. This story really stayed with me, and I wanted to share a few honest thoughts with you. I believe protecting our own peace is one of the most important things we can do. Setting boundaries does not make us unkind. It makes us responsible for our well-being. We all deserve relationships that honor our value and the value of our children. Choosing honesty, even when it is difficult, opens the door to genuine healing. Taking responsibility for our finances and our emotions can truly transform our lives. Real kindness includes being kind to ourselves, not just to others. I hope this encourages you to reflect on the relationships in your own life. You have the right to choose calm over constant discomfort. And remember, sometimes the most loving thing we can do is create space for a healthier future. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.